My name is Zoe. I am 35 years old and somehow still healing from the wounds my family inflicted. As a successful tech logistics developer, I thought I had finally escaped their toxic grasp, but I maintained occasional contact out of a misplaced sense of loyalty. The moment my parents demanded I hand over my entire fortune to my sister, I realized I was never truly family to them. I was just a bank account waiting to be drained. But when I finally slammed the door on all of them, the shocking fallout changed everything forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and tried to use you for their own financial gain. The clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of jazz should have made the private dining room at the upscale Atlanta steakhouse feel elegant. Instead, the air inside the room was thick with undeniable tension. I sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table staring blankly at the glossy legal document my brother-in-law Kendrick had just forcefully slid across the white tablecloth. The thick paper stopped right next to my untouched plate of expensive filet mignon. The bold heading at the very top of the page read, "Irrevocable Financial Transfer Agreement," in large black letters. I looked up from the threatening piece of paper to see my younger sister Brianna picking at her lobster tail. She was deliberately refusing to make eye contact with me. Across from her, my mother Brenda and my father Pastor Thomas sat with their hands folded together on the table. They were presenting a united and righteous front against me. Kendrick leaned back in his expensive leather chair and adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit with a highly smug smile on his face. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who truly believed he held all the winning cards in his hand. "Sign the paper," Zoe Kendrick said in a smooth and demanding tone. "We already had our legal team drafted up for you. It is a completely standard agreement. All you need to do is authorize the immediate transfer of $5 million to my real estate investment fund by tomorrow morning." I stared at him in absolute silence. My mind was actively struggling to process the sheer audacity of his ridiculous demand. $5 million. That amount was far more than half of the $8 million liquid buyout I had just received from selling my tech logistics startup. I had built that company from the ground up. It required a decade of my sweat and countless sleepless nights and relentless personal sacrifice. Before I could even articulate a proper response to his insane request, my mother Brenda leaned forward across the table. Her voice immediately took on that sickeningly sweet and persuasive tone she always used when she was trying to bend the world to her selfish will. "Now, Zoe." My mother began softly placing her perfectly manicured hand completely over mine. "Do not look so defensive and angry with us. We are celebrating your massive success tonight as a family. $8 million is way more money than you could ever possibly spend in a single lifetime. You are just a single woman. You do not have a husband or any children to provide for right now. Kendrick is on the verge of a massive commercial real estate acquisition, but his investment fund is experiencing a very temporary liquidity issue. He urgently needs this $5 million to save the deal from collapsing. You should simply think of it as a generous investment in your own family." I slowly pulled my hand out from under hers and placed it back in my lap. "A temporary liquidity issue," I repeated out loud. My voice remained steady, despite the intense rage boiling deep in my chest. "You mean he is completely broke and he needs me to bail him out of his terrible business decisions?" Brianna suddenly slammed her heavy silver fork down against the fine china plate. The loud clatter echoed sharply off the walls of the private dining room. "Stop acting like you are so much better than us," she snapped loudly. Her voice was incredibly shrill and dripping with absolute venom. "Kendrick is a true visionary. He is building real generational wealth for this entire family. You just got extremely lucky with some basic computer code. You actually owe us this money, Zoe. Without the unwavering support of this family, you would be absolutely nothing today. You have a strict moral obligation to help us out right now." "An obligation?" I asked her while slowly raising one eyebrow. I leaned forward and rested my elbows firmly on the table. "And why exactly do I owe you $5 million? My mother let out a very dramatic sigh and shook her head side to side as if I were a deeply disappointing child. Because we gave you absolutely everything, Zoe, she said, as her voice began rising in volume to dominate the conversation. We put a safe roof over your head for years. We raised you properly in a good Christian home. We even gave you $10,000 to help pay for your college tuition when you finally moved out. You owe this family your ultimate loyalty. Giving us this money is simply the Christian thing to do. Your father and I fully expect you to sign that legal document tonight before we leave this restaurant. The sudden mention of that $10,000 was the exact emotional trigger I needed to finally drop my polite and quiet facade. For many long years, I had bitten my tongue just to keep the peace at family gatherings. For years, I had allowed them to constantly rewrite our shared history to perfectly suit their twisted narrative of the beloved golden child and the ungrateful scapegoat. But that stops tonight. I calmly reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my personal banking application and navigated directly to my archived wire transfer history. I laid the glowing screen face up in the absolute center of the table and tapped it once to keep it from going dark. Take a very good look at that screen right now, I said. My voice dropped a full octave and lost all remaining traces of warmth or daughterly affection. That is a verified digital receipt from exactly 8 years ago. You will clearly see a wire transfer from my personal account directly to your joint checking account in the exact amount of $30,000. I paid back your $10,000 college contribution with 200% interest attached to it, and I did all of that while I was living alone in a rat-infested studio apartment and working 2 full-time jobs just to keep my new startup company afloat. My father, who had been uncharacteristically quiet until this exact moment, cleared his throat rather awkwardly. Now, Zoe, he muttered softly. There is absolutely no need to keep score like this. Real family is never about keeping score. I laughed directly in his face. It was a sharp and bitter sound that held zero genuine humor. It is incredibly funny that you say that, Dad, because you all seem to keep a very precise financial score when it comes to me and my life. But let us talk about Brianna's personal score for a minute, shall we? I turned my sharp gaze directly to my younger sister, who suddenly looked very intensely interested in folding her cloth napkin. How about the $200,000 you two secretly drained from Mom and Dad's retirement fund over the last 3 years? Brianna gasped loudly, and her face flushed a deep crimson color. That was a legitimate business loan, she protested weakly while shrinking back in her large chair. A business loan, I challenged her aggressively, without backing down for a single second. You spent $80,000 trying to launch a ridiculous luxury clothing boutique that went completely bankrupt in less than 6 months. It failed because you actively refused to actually work at the store yourself. And the other $120,000. That money went directly toward paying for your lavish destination wedding in Cabo San Lucas. A wedding, I might add, that I was not even invited to be a bridesmaid in because I apparently did not fit the visual aesthetic of your professional photographs. You selfishly blew their entire life savings on designer dresses and giant ice sculptures. And now you expect to steal my hard-earned money to fund your husband's failing real estate schemes. The private dining room fell completely dead silent. The harsh truth hung in the empty air around us. It was heavy and completely undeniable. I saw my mother actually flinch as the painful reality of her depleted retirement account clearly stung her pride. But instead of finally holding Brianna accountable for her actions, my mother instinctively rallied to defend her favorite golden child, just as she always had done in the past. That is an entirely different situation, Brenda snapped angrily. Her eyes narrowed with intense maternal fury. Brianna is a married woman now. She has a very certain social status to uphold in our local church community. You have always been so incredibly jealous of her, Zoe. You have always been petty and spiteful about her success. We are not asking you for a simple handout here. We are generously offering you a rare chance to be part of something much bigger than your selfish little tech company. I slowly pushed my heavy wooden chair backward and stood up to my full height. I am not signing anything tonight, I said firmly. My voice carried a quiet but very dangerous finality to it. I am not bailing Kendrick out of whatever disastrous financial mess he has created for himself this time. And I am certainly not funding Brianna's grand delusion of wealth for another decade. My money is completely mine. I earned every single penny of it through hard work while you all just watched and waited for me to fail. The free ride is officially over. I picked up my purse and prepared to walk out of that suffocating room and never look back. I felt a massive emotional weight rapidly lifting off my tired shoulders. I was finally choosing myself over their demands. I was finally walking away from the constant emotional drain of a toxic family that only ever saw me as a financial resource to be exploited. But exactly as I turned toward the heavy mahogany door to leave, Kendrick's smug and arrogant laughter physically stopped me right in my tracks. It was not the desperate or sad laugh of a defeated man who had just lost his only financial lifeline. It was a cold and calculating chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. He slowly stood up from the table and began casually buttoning his expensive suit jacket. "Oh," Zoe Kendrick said while shaking his head side to side in mock pity. "Did you really think we were simply asking for your permission tonight?" Kendrick dropped his charming and polite facade entirely. His dark eyes grew incredibly hard and deeply menacing. He raised his right hand in the air and snapped his fingers loudly. Almost immediately, the heavy mahogany door swung open from the outside. A tall white man wearing a very sharp gray suit stepped directly into our private dining room. He was carrying a black leather briefcase in one hand and a thick manila envelope in the other. He clearly did not look like a restaurant manager or a waiter. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a ruthless corporate litigator. "This is Mr. Sterling," Kendrick announced very smoothly. He stepped casually aside to let the serious lawyer approach our dining table. "Mr. Sterling legally represents the financial interests of this family." Mr. Sterling pulled a thick stack of complex legal documents from his envelope and placed them precisely on the table where my plate of food had been sitting earlier. They were clearly stamped with the official blue seal of the Fulton County Superior Court system. "Good evening, Miss Zoe," the lawyer said in a flat tone. His voice was completely devoid of any human emotion. "I am officially serving you with legal notice of an emergency court injunction filed today against your corporate business assets." I frowned deeply and looked down at the intimidating papers, but I actively refused to touch them with my hands. "What exactly are you talking about right now?" "I own my tech company completely outright. There are absolutely no other legal shareholders involved." My father slowly stood up from his chair. He deliberately refused to meet my angry eyes. He looked out the large glass window at the glowing Atlanta city skyline instead. "10 years ago," Zoe Pastor Thomas said in a very quiet and ashamed voice, "when you first started your little software company, you could not get approved for a commercial lease on your own credit. You specifically asked me to co-sign the long-term rental agreement for that tiny office space down on Peachtree Street." I felt a sudden and very icy drop in the pit of my stomach. The lawyer tapped the top document twice with a silver metal pen. "According to the original Articles of Incorporation and the attached commercial liability agreements, your father assumed a significant financial risk during the foundational stage of your enterprise. Under strict Georgia business law, we are successfully arguing that this historical action actually constitutes a silent legal partnership. We are officially filing a financial claim for exactly 40% of your entire company's sale value." Kendrick leaned aggressively across the table until his face was just inches away from mine. His breath smelled strongly of expensive bourbon and pure, unadulterated malice. 40% of $8 million is $3.2 million, Zoe Kendrick whispered cruelly. "But legal fees are so incredibly expensive these days, and corporate litigation can easily tie up your money in the court system for many long years. Your corporate buyers might even pull out of the deal entirely if they see a messy lawsuit suddenly attached to your intellectual property rights. So here is the real deal being offered to you." Kendrick reached out and tapped the irrevocable financial transfer agreement that was still sitting untouched on the white tablecloth. "You sit back down and sign over the $5 million right now tonight, and we will graciously drop this entire lawsuit. Your father will officially release his partnership claim. But if you walk out that door right now, we will legally freeze every single cent of your $8 million by tomorrow morning. You will not have access to a single dime of your money. You will lose absolutely everything you built over the last decade." "You wanted to play hardball tonight, Zoe? Well, welcome to the big leagues. Now sit down in that chair and sign the paper." I walked out of that steakhouse with the lawyer's threats echoing loudly in my ears. By 9 o'clock the very next morning, my phone buzzed with an automated alert from my primary financial institution. The screen displayed a cold and terrifying message stating that my accounts were currently locked under a pending legal injunction. I quickly logged into my personal banking application, only to see bright red banners plastered across every single dashboard. They had actually done it. Kendrick and my father had successfully leveraged a decade-old signature on a commercial lease agreement to completely freeze the $8 million I had just secured from selling my tech logistics startup. My corporate lawyers immediately advised me to stay completely out of sight and let them handle the complex legal filings over the weekend. They told me to lay low and avoid any contact with my family. But hiding from bullies has never been my style. Sunday morning was rapidly approaching, and if my toxic family wanted to wage a public war against my livelihood, they were going to have to look me dead in the eye while they did it. I woke up early on Sunday and took my time getting ready for the day. I put on a tailored emerald green dress that screamed quiet success and paired it with my absolute favorite designer heels. I drove my car across town toward the massive brick building of the prominent African American church where my father had served as the senior pastor for over 20 years. This megachurch was the absolute epicenter of Atlanta high society and religious community life. It was a place where your social status was heavily measured by how much you donated to the building fund and how brightly you smiled during fellowship hour. My family treated this massive church like their own personal kingdom. They expected everyone to bow down to their righteous image without question. As I walked up the wide concrete steps toward the heavy wooden double doors, I could already feel the heavy weight of 1,000 judgmental stares locking onto me. Word travels incredibly fast in our tight-knit community. I knew that Kendrick and Brianna had already spent the last 48 hours spinning a massive web of lies about me to anyone who would listen. The usher at the front door gave me a tight and highly uncomfortable smile as he handed me a weekly program. I walked straight down the center aisle of the sprawling sanctuary with my head held high and my posture perfectly straight. I actively ignored the aggressive whispers and the obvious pointing from the older congregation members sitting in the pews. I found an empty seat in the third row directly behind my family and their usual reserved seating area. My mother Brenda stiffened noticeably when she heard me sit down, but she completely refused to turn around and acknowledge my presence. Brianna shifted nervously in her seat, while bouncing her toddler roughly on her knee. Kendrick just stared straight ahead at the large wooden cross glowing on the brightly lit stage. The massive choir finished their opening hymn, and the entire congregation settled into their padded seats. My father, Pastor Thomas, stepped up to the expensive clear acrylic podium. He adjusted his microphone and looked out over the sea of faces before his eyes briefly locked onto mine. He did not look like a loving father who was happy to see his daughter. He looked exactly like a ruthless politician preparing to deliver a calculated smear campaign against his biggest rival. He opened his leather-bound Bible and cleared his throat loudly. Today, my brothers and sisters, we are going to talk about the deadly sin of greed, my father boomed into the microphone. His deep and charismatic voice echoed powerfully through the massive sound system. We are going to talk about the deep spiritual rot that happens when we allow the pursuit of worldly wealth to completely blind us to the sacred bonds of family. I sat there completely motionless as he launched into a highly emotional and entirely hypocritical sermon designed to destroy my reputation. It is a terrible tragedy to witness young people today achieving great financial success only to completely turn their backs on the very people who raised them, my father shouted. He wiped a fake bead of sweat from his forehead with a pristine white cloth for added dramatic effect. We see greedy children who conveniently forget their humble roots the second they get a small taste of corporate success. They sit in their fancy glass offices and let their own flesh and blood starve in the streets while they feast on the spoils of their unchecked ambition. The large congregation erupted into loud murmurs of agreement and scattered applause. Dozens of people began turning their heads to shoot me nasty side eyes and openly judgmental glares. They all knew exactly who Pastor Thomas was talking about. He was successfully painting me as a heartless corporate villain in front of 2,000 devoted people. He continued his targeted verbal assault for another 45 minutes without ever taking a break. He expertly manipulated scripture to justify his own selfish demands for my hard-earned money. He framed Kendrick's failing real estate fund as a righteous community endeavor that was being maliciously blocked by my supposed greed and extreme selfishness. I did not flinch once. I did not lower my gaze to the floor. I simply sat there and stared directly back at him while taking mental notes of every single lie he told from that sacred pulpit. When the final prayer was finally spoken, and the church band began playing the closing music, I stood up slowly and smoothed the front of my green dress. I knew the hardest part of the morning was still waiting for me out in the crowded church lobby. The sermon was just the opening act for the real confrontation. I pushed my way through the heavy sanctuary doors and stepped into the brightly lit fellowship hall. Almost immediately, I was aggressively cornered by a tight group of older women known locally as the church aunties. These were the wealthy and deeply judgmental matriarchs of the congregation who always made it their personal business to police everyone else's morality. Auntie Shirley, a woman who wore far too much expensive floral perfume, stepped directly into my personal space with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Zoe, it is an absolute shame to see you behaving this way," she scolded me loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Your poor mother has been crying her eyes out all morning long over your terrible actions. How can you possibly abandon your own sister when she needs you the most in her life? We all thought you were raised to be a much better Christian than this." Right on cue, Brianna pushed her way through the growing crowd of nosy onlookers. She was carrying her crying toddler on her hip and holding a balled-up tissue in her free hand. She looked absolutely pathetic, and she was milking the situation for everything it was worth to make me look like a monster. "Please, Zoe," she begged in a loud and wavering voice that was perfectly calibrated for maximum dramatic effect. "You have to lift the legal freeze and give Kendrick the money right now. The bank is threatening to foreclose on our beautiful house by the very end of the month. We are going to be living out on the dangerous streets with a small child while you sit comfortably on your $8 million fortune. Why are you being so incredibly cruel to your own family when we have done nothing but love you?" The church aunties gasped in dramatic unison and began shaking their heads in absolute disgust at me. I looked at my fake crying sister, and then I looked directly into the judgmental eyes of Auntie Shirley. I felt a cold and absolute calm wash over my entire body. I was completely done playing by their twisted rules of public respectability and forced silence. "Brianna is not going to lose her house because of me," I said in a loud and carrying voice that instantly silenced the murmurs of the surrounding crowd. "She is going to lose her house because she married a man who borrows millions of dollars and has absolutely nothing to show for it except a closet full of tailored suits and a leased sports car. But since we are airing out all of our dirty family laundry right here in the fellowship lobby, let us talk about who the real victim is in this situation. Let us talk about what real cruelty actually looks like behind closed doors." I took a deliberate step toward the nosy group of older women, forcing them to slightly back away from me. "Where exactly were all of your Christian tears for me when I was 19 years old?" I asked Auntie Shirley directly while staring right into her eyes. "Did you cry for me when I was working exhausting night shifts, mopping filthy floors at a 24-hour diner on the bad side of town? Because I distinctly remember my loving parents cutting off my grocery money and my transportation budget entirely during my sophomore year of college. And do you know exactly why they did that to their own daughter? They cut me off so they could afford to buy Brianna a brand new Mercedes-Benz for her high school graduation present. I was literally eating leftover diner food out of discarded to-go boxes while you all clapped for her shiny new luxury car in this exact same parking lot." Auntie Shirley opened her mouth to speak, but she could not find a single word to say in response. Her face turned a very pale shade of gray as the uncomfortable truth hung heavy in the tense air. Brianna instantly stopped her fake crying and took a nervous step backward as the crowd of onlookers suddenly turned their confused attention toward her. My mother Brenda tried to rush over to intervene and save face, but I simply held up my hand to stop her in her tracks. "Do not ever try to publicly guilt-trip me about family loyalty again," I told them all with absolute finality in my voice. "You lost that right a very long time ago when you chose money over me." I turned my back on my stunned family and walked right out of the large glass doors of the church. The warm Atlanta sun hit my face as I marched confidently across the paved parking lot toward my car. I unlocked the door and slid into the leather driver's seat, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. The silence inside the cabin of my car was a welcome relief from the chaotic noise of the church. I took a moment to close my eyes and steady my racing heartbeat. I had known this confrontation was inevitable, but actually living through the public humiliation was still deeply exhausting. I let out a long breath and reached into my designer purse to grab my smartphone. I had completely isolated my communications over the weekend, except for one specific contact. A notification popped up on the bright screen, breaking the silence of the vehicle. It was a secure, encrypted email from the elite private forensic accountant I had secretly hired exactly 48 hours ago. I had paid him an exorbitant retainer fee to dig into every single financial transaction tied to Kendrick's name. I opened the encrypted messaging application and stared down at the newly arrived document. I read the bold subject line glowing against the dark background of the screen. Kendrick's Fund, Urgent Fraud Evidence. A slow and victorious smile spread across my face as I finally started the engine. I threw my car into drive and pulled out of the sprawling church parking lot, leaving my angry family completely behind me. I did not go back to my condo. Instead, I drove straight to a quiet coffee shop a few miles away and parked in the very back corner of their empty lot. I needed absolute silence to process whatever my forensic accountant had uncovered. I opened the encrypted application on my phone and tapped the attached PDF document. As I began reading through the dense financial analysis, my blood ran completely cold. Kendrick was not a real estate mogul. He had never actually purchased a single commercial property in the entire state of Georgia. He was running a massive Ponzi scheme, and his primary target was the very church community we had just left. The thick dossier outlined a devastating and highly calculated trail of fake investment brochures and complex shell companies. These entities were specifically designed to siphon retirement savings from elderly congregation members who trusted their pastor completely. Kendrick had been taking their hard-earned cash and using it to fund Brianna's lavish lifestyle while briefly paying off the initial investors with money stolen from the newest victims. But the fragile house of cards was rapidly collapsing around him. The forensic accountant had managed to flag a highly classified pending federal inquiry. The Securities and Exchange Commission was officially scheduled to conduct a massive financial audit of Kendrick's entire investment firm by the end of the current month. The truth hit me like a physical punch to the gut. Kendrick did not need $5 million to save a lucrative commercial real estate deal. He needed exactly $5 million in liquid cash to completely replace the stolen church funds before the federal investigators knocked on his front door. He was desperately trying to use my hard-earned tech company buyout to save himself from a lengthy federal prison sentence. And if I gave him that money, I would technically become a criminal accessory to his massive financial fraud. I scrolled through the pages of bank routing numbers and fake property deeds. The sheer scale of his deception was breathtaking. He had preyed on vulnerable widows and working-class families who had faithfully attended my father's church for decades. He was a financial predator wearing a tailored suit and carrying a leather-bound Bible. I threw my phone onto the passenger seat and slammed my foot down on the gas pedal. I navigated the familiar winding roads of my affluent childhood neighborhood with a rapidly rising sense of pure panic. Despite everything they had said to me in front of the entire congregation earlier that morning, I still felt a deep moral obligation to warn my parents. I had to stop them before they were permanently dragged down into Kendrick's rapidly sinking ship. I aggressively pulled my car into the wide circular driveway of their massive brick colonial home. The house was a pristine monument to my father's lifelong obsession with outward appearances and social status. I did not even bother knocking on the front door. I pushed open the heavy mahogany entryway and marched straight down the long hardwood hallway toward the kitchen. My mother and father were sitting casually at the large marble island drinking sweet iced tea and eating leftover Sunday dinner. They both looked up in extreme shock and immediate annoyance as I stormed into the room. I slammed the thick printed dossier directly onto the polished marble countertop right between their matching crystal glasses. "You need to read this entire document right now," I demanded while struggling to catch my breath. "You need to completely distance yourselves from Kendrick and Brianna immediately. He is not a legitimate businessman or a real estate investor. He is actively stealing millions of dollars from your own congregation, and the federal government is about to raid his corporate office." My father slowly put down his glass of iced tea and looked at the thick stack of papers with deep suspicion. "What exactly is this ridiculous nonsense, Zoe?" he asked in a highly irritated and condescending tone. "This is a certified forensic accounting report," I explained rapidly, while pointing at the official letterhead. "I hired an elite private investigator to look into Kendrick's magical investment fund. He is running a massive Ponzi scheme, Dad. He is using your devoted church members as his own personal piggy bank. That $5 million he tried to extort from me last night at the steakhouse is exactly the amount he needs to cover up his federal crimes before the SEC audit destroys him." My mother Brenda abruptly stood up from her tall wooden bar stool. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the marble counter as her face twisted into a mask of absolute pure rage. Without a single word of warning, she reached entirely across the wide kitchen island and slapped me hard across the left side of my face. The sharp physical crack of her hand striking my cheek echoed loudly through the large, pristine kitchen. The sudden violent strike completely stunned me, forcing me to take a staggering step backward to catch my balance. I raised my trembling hand to my violently stinging cheek and stared at her in total disbelief. "How dare you come into my peaceful home and spread these vicious lies about your own brother-in-law?" she screamed at the absolute top of her lungs. "You are sick, Zoe. You are deeply mentally sick and twisted." "I did not forge these financial documents," I fired back, while pointing a shaking finger at the thick dossier. "The verified bank routing numbers and the fake corporate wire transfers are literally printed right there on page 4. He is going to federal prison. Mom, if you do not legally cut ties with him right now, you will lose your flawless community reputation and your massive church forever." "You are just jealous," Brenda shouted back at me while violently pushing the unread dossier off the marble counter. The heavy stack of papers hit the ground and scattered all over the polished hardwood floor. "You have always been insanely jealous of your beautiful sister. Brianna actually found a handsome and highly successful man to marry. She is building a beautiful and wealthy family, while you sit completely alone in your expensive downtown apartment, with absolutely nothing but your glowing computer screen to keep you company. You are a single and bitter woman, Zoe. You could not stand seeing your younger sister so happy and blessed. So you actually paid a shady criminal to manufacture this disgusting pile of lies, just to destroy her perfect marriage. You are the only fraud in this family." My father stood up from his chair and placed a comforting and protective arm around my mother's shaking shoulders. He looked at me with an expression of profound disgust, as if I were a piece of rotting garbage that someone had thoughtlessly dragged into his spotless kitchen. "Your mother is absolutely right, Zoe," my father said using his deepest and most authoritative preaching voice. "Your aggressive actions today are completely unforgivable in the eyes of the Lord. Kendrick is a highly respected pillar of this entire community. He is so incredibly successful and generously devoted to our family that he just proved his absolute financial brilliance to us last week." I stared at him with a dark sense of impending dread slowly pooling in the bottom of my stomach. "What exactly did he do for you last week?" I asked in a very quiet and terrified whisper. My father puffed out his chest with immense foolish pride. "He generously helped us secure a $1 million equity loan on this very house," he declared confidently. "We are finally building the massive new youth center for the church. The traditional neighborhood banks were moving far too slowly with their endless underwriting paperwork, so Kendrick generously used his own private lending partners to completely fast-track the entire approval process. We signed the final mortgage paperwork on Friday afternoon. My blood ran completely cold in my veins. The harsh, stinging pain in my cheek completely vanished and was instantly replaced by a crushing wave of pure, absolute horror. They did not just verbally vouch for Kendrick. They had literally handed him the legal deed to their home. I looked down at the scattered pages on the kitchen floor and suddenly understood the most terrifying part of Kendrick's entire scam. The sketchy shadow lender he used was heavily documented in that exact dossier. The private lending partners were actually dummy shell corporations completely controlled by Kendrick himself. My parents had unknowingly mortgaged their family home to a predatory shadow lender operated by the very man who was about to be indicted for federal wire fraud. He successfully manipulated them to give away everything they owned for nothing. I walked out of my parents' house feeling entirely numb and completely emotionally drained. I did not bother arguing with them any further. There was absolutely no point in trying to save people who were aggressively fighting to stay on a sinking ship. I drove my car back to my downtown apartment in complete and total silence, while my mind raced to process the massive legal disaster my family had just willingly created. I barely slept a single wink during that long and stressful Sunday night. I tossed and turned in bed while thinking about how easily my mother and father had handed over the deed to their home to a financial predator just to impress the local church community. By Monday morning, the inevitable retaliation for my unexpected visit arrived. Kendrick and Brianna had obviously visited my parents and discovered my attempt to expose the Ponzi scheme. They fully realized I possessed hard evidence of their financial crimes, and they decided to immediately escalate their attacks to back me into a corner. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, my phone buzzed with an incoming email notification. The sender of the message was Mr. Sterling, the ruthless corporate litigator Kendrick had paraded into the steakhouse 2 nights prior. I opened the message and read the harsh words glowing brightly on my screen. The email was not a polite legal inquiry or a standard civil negotiation. It was a vicious and highly calculated extortion attempt, cleverly disguised as a corporate settlement offer. Mr. Sterling stated that my parents were incredibly distressed by my hostile behavior and had officially authorized Kendrick to act as their primary financial proxy in the ongoing partnership dispute. The digital email contained a strict and terrifying ultimatum. I had until 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon to sign the irrevocable transfer agreement and hand over the $5 million. If I refused to comply by the Friday deadline, they were going to launch a massive media smear campaign against me and my tech startup. Attached to the email was a fully drafted press release. The completely fabricated document falsely claimed that the highly profitable foundational code for my logistics software was actually based entirely on intellectual property, brutally stolen from my father during the early struggling days of my business. They were planning to send this fabricated story to every major tech blog and news outlet in Atlanta, framing me as a deceitful daughter who robbed her own father to get rich. My blood boiled incredibly hot as I slowly read through the absolutely disgusting lies printed directly on the digital page. But before I could even forward the threatening email to my own lawyers, my phone began ringing frantically on my desk. The caller ID displayed the name of the lead venture capital partner at the firm currently acquiring my company. I answered the call and was immediately hit with a heavy wall of sheer corporate panic. The partner sounded incredibly angry and deeply anxious. He informed me that Kendrick's lawyer had already sent a courtesy copy of the fake press release to their executive board just to prove they were deadly serious about the media threat. The venture capital firm was a highly conservative financial institution that completely despised negative public relations. They did not care if the allegations of stolen intellectual property were entirely baseless. They only cared about protecting their own pristine corporate image and their massive financial investments. The lead partner did not mince his words with me. He told me that a messy public lawsuit involving stolen family assets would completely tank the valuation of my logistics software. He explicitly threatened to invoke the morality and litigation clauses hidden deep within our acquisition contract. If I did not make this ugly family dispute disappear immediately, they were going to pull out of the $18 million deal entirely. My heart dropped heavily into my stomach. My entire life's work was suddenly teetering on the edge of a massive cliff. I had spent 10 long years sacrificing my personal life and my mental health to build this company from the ground up. I had missed holidays and birthdays and countless social events just to write code and secure exclusive shipping contracts. Now my greedy sister and her criminal husband were about to burn my entire legacy to the ground simply because I refused to fund their fake luxury lifestyle. For a brief and terrifying moment, I felt a massive wave of absolute despair wash over my body. I felt the incredibly familiar urge to just give in and pay the ransom to make the pain stop. It is the exact same toxic conditioning my family had forcefully programmed into me since my early childhood. Just give Brianna what she wants and keep the peace, Zoe. Just sacrifice your own happiness so the rest of the family can look good in front of the church congregation, Zoe. But as I sat all alone in my quiet apartment, looking at the beautiful skyline of the city, I had conquered. A profound emotional shift happened deep inside my mind. The paralyzing fear completely evaporated from my chest. The heavy sadness vanished into thin air. I did not panic, and I certainly did not cry over their cruel betrayal. Instead, my entire demeanor went completely ice cold. I realized that Kendrick was playing a very desperate and sloppy game of checkers while falsely assuming I did not know how to play chess. He was acting out of pure desperation because the federal government was closing in on him. I immediately scheduled an emergency video conference with my own high-power legal team. I did not hire cheap neighborhood attorneys when I started my business. I retained some of the most aggressive and brilliant corporate defense lawyers in the entire state of Georgia. When the secure video grid popped up on my computer screen, I laid out the entire situation with absolute and unwavering clarity. I showed them the brutal extortion email from Mr. Sterling. I showed them the fake press release threatening my public reputation. And most importantly, I showed them the forensic accounting dossier proving Kendrick's entire real estate fund was a rapidly collapsing Ponzi scheme currently under federal investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. My lead attorney, a sharp and ruthless woman with a fierce reputation for destroying corporate bullies, reviewed the documents with a predatory gleam in her dark eyes. She quickly confirmed exactly what I had suspected all along. By putting his demand for $5 million in writing and attaching a direct threat to destroy my business, Kendrick's lawyer had foolishly crossed the line from a civil partnership dispute into a documented federal crime. This was clear-cut wire fraud and illegal corporate extortion. We spent the next 3 consecutive hours mapping out a flawless and devastating legal counterattack. I was not just going to passively defend myself against their baseless claims anymore. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire fraudulent operation and legally sever myself from my toxic family forever. I needed to trap them all in a single room and force them to sign away all of their fabricated legal leverage before the federal government arrived to arrest Kendrick. But I also urgently needed to secure my parents' massive property mortgage to ensure they could never use the family home to bail him out of federal prison. I looked back at the thick forensic dossier and zeroed in on the dummy shell corporation Kendrick was secretly using as a shadow lender. The firm was severely over-leveraged and desperately bleeding cash because Kendrick's Ponzi scheme was failing to bring in new investors to keep the scam alive. A brilliant and incredibly ruthless financial strategy rapidly formed in my mind. I ended the video call with my legal team and immediately picked up my phone to call the panicked venture capital partner back. He answered on the very first ring, fully expecting me to concede defeat and beg for more time. I did not give him the chance to speak a single word. "Do not pull out of our acquisition deal," I told him in a cold and commanding voice that left absolutely no room for argument or hesitation. "In fact, I need you to expedite a secondary buyout immediately using a subsidiary shell company under your corporate umbrella." The wealthy partner paused on the line, clearly confused by my sudden aggressive change in tone. "What exactly are you talking about, Zoe?" he asked nervously. "What are we buying?" I looked at the legal name of Kendrick's failing shadow lending firm, printed clearly on the dossier in front of me. "We are going to buy a specific high-risk commercial loan portfolio right here in Atlanta," I replied with a chilling smile. "We are going to become their absolute worst nightmare and take everything they stole right back." I hung up the phone with the venture capital partner and immediately began the next phase of my carefully calculated plan. I needed to convince my toxic family that they had completely broken my spirit. I needed them to believe that their ruthless extortion tactics had successfully driven me to the absolute edge of despair. I poured myself a cold glass of water and practiced taking a few shallow, shaky breaths. I needed my voice to sound utterly defeated and completely drained of all its usual strength. I picked up my smartphone and dialed my father's personal cell phone number. He answered on the second ring with a very smug and heavy silence. He was clearly waiting for me to grovel and beg for his mercy. "Dad," I whispered softly, allowing my voice to crack just the right amount to sound genuinely heartbroken. "I cannot fight you all anymore. You win." The heavy silence on the other end of the line was instantly replaced by a deep sigh of righteous satisfaction. "I knew you would eventually see the light and do the right thing," Zoe, my father said, using his most condescending pastoral tone. "The Lord always has a way of humbling those who become overly prideful and arrogant with their earthly wealth. Your mother and I have been praying for your stubborn heart all week long. We are very glad you have finally decided to act like a true member of this family and support Kendrick's business." I squeezed my eyes shut and let out a fake sob that sounded incredibly convincing. "I am not doing this because I want to support Kendrick." I cried into the receiver. "I am doing this because I am completely exhausted. You and Kendrick have successfully backed me into a corner. My corporate buyers are threatening to cancel the entire company acquisition because of your fake press release. I will give you the $5 million you demanded. I will authorize the financial transfer so you will drop the ridiculous lawsuit and leave my business alone." My father chuckled softly. It was a cold and victorious sound that made my skin crawl. "That is a very wise corporate decision, Zoe. Kendrick will send Mr. Sterling over to your apartment this evening to collect the signed paperwork and the certified bank check." "No," I said sharply, suddenly dropping the fake crying act just enough to show a tiny spark of desperate defiance. "Mr. Sterling is not coming anywhere near my personal residence, and I am not just handing over $5 million without strict legal protections of my own. If I am giving up the majority of my hard-earned tech buyout to save Kendrick's failing real estate fund, I have one absolute non-negotiable condition." "What exactly is your condition?" my father asked cautiously. "I want a global release of claims," I stated firmly. "My corporate lawyers are drafting the document right now. It is an ironclad legal contract. It explicitly states that in exchange for this $5 million settlement, every single one of you must legally sever all familial and financial ties to me forever. You will all permanently forfeit any future claims to my current estate, my future business ventures, and my personal assets. You will officially disown me on paper, and in return, you get the money you want so badly." There was a brief pause on the phone. I waited for some sign of paternal hesitation. I waited for my father to say that he loved his daughter too much to legally erase her from his life for a payout, but the hesitation never came. "If that is what you truly want, Zoe," he replied coldly, "we can certainly accommodate your dramatic terms. You all have to come to my downtown corporate office on Friday at exactly noon," I instructed him. "You, Mom, Brianna, and Kendrick must all be present in my main boardroom to sign the legal documents in front of my corporate notary. No lawyers are allowed in the room, just the five of us handling family business one last time. If you all sign the release forms, I will hand over the authorized bank transfer paperwork directly to Kendrick." "We will be there," my father confirmed eagerly. "Have the money ready." He hung up the phone without even saying goodbye. He did not express a single ounce of sadness or regret about permanently severing his relationship with his eldest daughter. He only cared about securing the massive payday. I lowered the phone from my ear and stared blankly at the dark screen. Any lingering guilt I might have felt about the devastating trap I was currently setting for them completely vanished in that exact moment. They were entirely willing to sell my place in the family for $5 million. I was simply going to let them sign the receipt. The sheer greed of my family was absolutely staggering. Within an hour of my phone call to my father, my sister Brianna could not resist the urge to gloat about her perceived victory. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter with a new incoming text message. I opened it to find a highly arrogant text from Brianna. The message read, "Glad you finally realized your proper place in this family. Do not forget to have the paperwork printed and ready for Kendrick on Friday. We have a very busy weekend planned. I stared at the incredibly smug text message and actually smiled. She was so blinded by her own greed and her burning desire to humiliate me that she could not see the massive legal snare tightening around her ankles. She actually thought she had outsmarted a woman who built an $18 million software company from scratch. I did not reply to her cruel text message. I simply took a digital screenshot of her words and forwarded the image directly to my lead corporate attorney to add to our growing pile of evidence. Every single arrogant move they made was just giving us more ammunition to use against them when the federal trap finally sprang shut. The next 48 hours were a chaotic blur of intense legal preparation and high-level corporate maneuvering. I worked closely with my venture capital partners to finalize the quiet secondary buyout of Kendrick's shadow lending firm. We moved massive amounts of capital through various subsidiary shell companies to ensure my name was completely hidden from the initial purchase agreements. By Thursday afternoon, my holding company was the official and legal owner of the high-risk commercial loan portfolio that currently held the mortgage to my parents' massive brick colonial house. I now held the legal deed to their home securely, in a fireproof safe located inside my downtown office. They were absolutely clueless about the massive shift in power. Thursday night finally arrived. I was sitting on the comfortable velvet sofa in my high-rise apartment, going over the final drafts of the global release of claims with a fine-tooth comb. The document was incredibly thorough. It explicitly detailed the $5 million extortion demand and framed the requested payout as a final severing of all relations. It was a masterpiece of corporate legal drafting. As I was reading through the final liability clauses, my tablet screen lit up with a social media notification. It was an alert from Instagram letting me know that my sister Brianna was currently broadcasting a live video to her thousands of followers. I normally ignored her superficial social media posts, but my gut instinct told me to tune in to this specific broadcast. I clicked the glowing notification and watched as Brianna's perfectly made-up face filled my screen. She was sitting in the expensive custom kitchen of her leased luxury home, holding a tall crystal flute filled with expensive imported champagne. She was wearing a designer silk robe and flashing her diamond wedding ring directly at the camera lens for everyone to admire. Cheers to everyone joining the live stream tonight. Brianna practically squealed into her phone. Her eyes were bright with unearned excitement and pure arrogance. I just had to get on here and celebrate with all of my amazing followers. My husband Kendrick has been working so incredibly hard on his real estate investment fund, and God is finally rewarding our faithfulness. We have a massive $5 million blessing coming our way tomorrow afternoon. I sat up straight on my sofa and immediately hit the screen record button on my tablet device. I could not believe how incredibly stupid she was being. She was literally broadcasting her financial crimes to the entire internet in real time. You all know how stressful business can be, Brianna continued while taking a large sip of her champagne. Sometimes you have to play hardball to get what you truly deserve in this world. We had a little bit of a tense family situation this week regarding some business assets, but my husband is a brilliant negotiator. He really put the pressure on and made certain people realize they had no choice but to hand over the funds. Tomorrow we are going into the city to sign the final paperwork and collect our $5 million check. This weekend we are going straight to the luxury car dealership to celebrate properly. God is so good. I watched her boastful performance with a cold and calculating intensity. She was openly bragging about the successful extortion of her own sister. She was explicitly stating that her husband used intense pressure to force me to hand over the funds. She was leaving a massive glowing digital trail of premeditated extortion and wire fraud right out in the open for anyone to find. I made absolutely sure the screen recording captured her entire drunken confession, including the exact timestamp and the hundreds of comments from her clueless followers congratulating her on her massive financial blessing. When she finally ended her live broadcast, I saved the high-definition video file directly to my secure cloud server. I then emailed a copy of the video to my lead attorney and the federal investigators who were already building the massive criminal case against Kendrick. Brianna thought she was flexing her wealth and power for her digital audience, In reality, she had just handed the Securities and Exchange Commission the exact piece of undeniable digital evidence they needed to prove premeditated intent. The trap was now fully set and bait was securely in place. All I had to do was wait for Friday at noon. Friday morning arrived with a bright and completely cloudless blue sky over the busy city of Atlanta. The sleek glass and steel skyscraper that housed my corporate headquarters stood tall against the morning sun, reflecting the light like a giant mirror. At exactly 5 minutes before noon, my desk phone buzzed, and my receptionist sent a brief digital message to my computer screen. My family had officially arrived in the main lobby downstairs. I stood up from my heavy oak desk and carefully smoothed the minor wrinkles from my tailored black suit. I took a deep and steadying breath. I walked out of my private executive office and made my way down the long carpeted hallway toward the main boardroom. The room was a massive space entirely enclosed by floor-to-ceiling soundproof glass walls that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the bustling downtown financial district. It was a room designed specifically to intimidate rivals and project absolute corporate dominance. Today, it was going to serve as the perfect setting for a final family farewell. I pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped into the chilled air of the room. My family was already seated confidently around the massive black marble conference table. They looked entirely out of place in my professional sanctuary, but they were all trying desperately to project a highly unearned air of superiority. Brianna was sitting near the head of the table wearing head-to-toe designer clothing. She had chosen a bright pink tweed blazer and a matching skirt that screamed newly rich, along with a massive pair of dark sunglasses resting on top of her head. Kendrick sat right next to her, looking incredibly smug and deeply arrogant. He kept repeatedly adjusting the heavy gold Rolex watch on his left wrist, making sure the expensive metal caught the bright overhead lights perfectly. My mother, Brenda, and my father, Pastor Thomas, sat directly across from them. They did not look around the impressive room or acknowledge the massive business empire their eldest daughter had successfully built. Instead, they stared directly at me with eyes full of cold and righteous judgment. They looked at me as if I were a deeply disappointing sinner who was finally showing up to beg for their sacred forgiveness. "Good afternoon," I said in a completely flat and emotionless voice. I did not offer anyone a polite greeting, a warm smile, or a customary family hug. I simply walked over to the opposite end of the long marble table and set my black leather briefcase down on the polished surface. I snapped the metallic locks open and pulled out a single thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy archival paper. "Let us just get right down to business," Kendrick said with an arrogant sneer crossing his face. "We have a very busy schedule planned for today, Zoe. Hand over the $5 million check so we can officially drop this silly little lawsuit and let you get back to staring at your computer screens in peace." I ignored his demanding tone completely. I took the thick stack of papers and firmly slid the document across the smooth marble table. The heavy paper glided perfectly and stopped right in front of my father. The bold black letters printed across the very top of the page clearly read, "Global release of claims and complete severance of familial rights. Before any money changes hands today, you are all going to read and sign this legal contract," I instructed them while taking a slow seat in my leather chair. My corporate lawyers spent the entire week making sure this specific document is completely bulletproof under Georgia state law. This is not just a simple financial settlement. This is a permanent and irrevocable dissolution of our entire relationship. My father put on his wire-rimmed reading glasses and looked down at the dense legal text. He scoffed loudly. "This is highly dramatic, Zoe," he muttered, shaking his head. "It is entirely necessary," I replied coldly. "I want everyone in this room to understand exactly what they are signing away today. By putting your legal signature on that dotted line, you are officially agreeing to take a $5 million payout in direct exchange for giving up any and all future claims to my personal estate. You are legally waiving your right to ever sue me again for any reason whatsoever. You are completely forfeiting any right to my current tech company and any future business ventures I might create. And most importantly, you are legally acknowledging that we are no longer a family in any capacity." If I end up in the hospital, you will have absolutely zero rights to visit me or make medical decisions on my behalf. If I pass away, you will not receive a single dime from my life insurance policies or my trust accounts. From the absolute second the ink dries on that paper, I am nothing more than a complete stranger to every single one of you. My mother rolled her eyes and let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed in the quiet room. You always had to make everything into a massive theatrical production, Zoe Brenda snapped sharply. You are the one who actively decided to turn your back on your own flesh and blood. You are the one who greedily refused to help your younger sister when her family was in desperate financial need. Do not try to sit there in your fancy suit and act like you are the poor victim in this situation. We are simply taking what we are rightfully owed for putting up with your incredibly selfish behavior all these years. I did not bother defending myself against her ridiculous accusations. I simply stared at her with a blank and unbothered expression. Are the strict terms of the contract completely clear to everyone at this table? I asked directly. Kendrick leaned forward and tapped the paper impatiently with his index finger. We completely understand the terms, Zoe. We take the money and we never have to deal with your terrible attitude ever again. It is a fantastic deal for us. Where exactly do we sign this thing? I reached into my suit pocket and retrieved a heavy silver fountain pen. I slid it across the marble table toward my father. Pastor Thomas picked up the expensive pen without a single moment of hesitation. He did not look at me with any lingering sadness in his eyes. He did not express any paternal regret about legally disowning his firstborn daughter for a cash payout. He simply flipped past the liability clauses to the final signature page of the contract and quickly scribbled his name on the designated line. He pressed down so hard the silver nib of the pen nearly tore right through the thick archival paper. There he said while pushing the document toward my mother, "The Lord knows I have tried my absolute best to save your soul, Zoe, but you have chosen the dark path of corporate greed and isolation. I wash my hands of you entirely." Brenda grabbed the silver pen and signed her name right below his. She did not even bother to look up at me while she wrote. She was entirely focused on the massive amount of money she believed was coming her way. She was probably already calculating exactly how much of it she could secretly siphon away to spend on new luxury furniture for the church rectory. Brianna eagerly snatched the legal document next. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh, as if signing the paper was a massive inconvenience to her busy social schedule. She signed her name with a loopy and incredibly childish cursive script. See how easy that was? She mocked me with a highly vicious smile on her face. You could have just given us the money on Sunday and saved yourself all this embarrassing legal drama. But you always had to do things the hard way just to prove a point. Finally, the contract made its way down to Kendrick. He was the designated financial beneficiary of the entire settlement agreement. He picked up the silver pen and twirled it confidently between his fingers. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. He truly believed he had beaten me at my own game. He believed he had successfully used his aggressive intimidation tactics to bully a wealthy female CEO into total submission. He flashed his bright white teeth and signed his full legal name on the very bottom line of the contract, ensuring his claim to the funds. He placed the silver pen down on the black marble table with a loud and satisfying click. "It is officially done," he announced proudly while leaning back in his chair. "We are legally dead to you, Zoe. Now stop wasting our valuable time and hand over the certified bank check. We have a scheduled VIP appointment at the Mercedes dealership in exactly 1 hour." The room fell completely silent. The heavy air inside the glass boardroom was practically buzzing with their greedy anticipation. They were all staring intently at my black leather briefcase, fully waiting for me to pull out a single piece of paper worth $5 million. I did not reach for my briefcase right away. Instead, I slowly stood up from my leather executive chair and walked around the edge of the large marble table. I calmly picked up the global release of claims and carefully inspected the final signature page. I checked to make absolutely sure every single signature was legible and correctly placed on the designated lines. The heavy black ink was dark and permanent. The legal contract was completely flawless and fully binding under federal and state law. I gently tapped the edges of the paper against the hard marble table to straighten the pages perfectly. I slipped the signed document securely into a hidden zipper compartment inside my black briefcase and firmly snapped the metallic locks completely shut. The sharp clicking sound echoed loudly in the quiet boardroom, signaling the end of the transaction. I looked down at the expensive gold watch wrapped tightly around Kendrick's wrist, and then I slowly looked at the sleek digital clock glowing brightly on the boardroom wall. It was exactly 12:15 in the afternoon. "Well?" Kendrick demanded impatiently while aggressively slamming his flat hand down on the marble table. "Where is the damn money, Zoe? We signed your stupid paper like you asked." I looked directly into his angry, dark eyes and offered him a very cold and terrifying smile. "The check is not coming," I told him in a soft and dangerously calm voice. Kendrick's face instantly contorted with intense, blistering rage. "What the hell did you just say to me?" he yelled while jumping up from his leather chair. "If you think you can back out of this deal right now, I will call Mr. Sterling and have your entire company frozen before you can even blink." "You are not calling anyone, Kendrick," I replied, completely unfazed by his sudden violent outburst. "Because your ride is finally here." Right on cue, the heavy silver doors of the private executive elevator located just outside the glass boardroom pinged open with a bright and cheerful chime. 4 men and 1 woman stepped purposefully out of the elevator cab and into the private reception area. They did not look like local police officers or private security guards. They were dressed in sharp dark suits, and they moved with the synchronized and highly intimidating precision of federal law enforcement. Heavy gold and blue badges hung securely from thick lanyards around their necks, bouncing slightly against their chests as they walked toward the glass boardroom. I recognized the official seals of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission gleaming brightly under the recessed ceiling lights. Walking directly alongside the lead federal agent was an older, distinguished gentleman carrying a thick leather briefcase. That man was Richard, the highly aggressive lead corporate attorney representing the venture capital firm that was actively acquiring my tech company. He had flown down from New York specifically to witness this exact moment. The heavy, soundproof glass door of the boardroom swung open. The sudden shift in air pressure felt like a physical weight dropping into the room. My mother Brenda and my father Pastor Thomas turned their heads toward the doorway with expressions of mild annoyance, clearly expecting my assistant to be delivering their $5 million check. But when they saw the grim faces of the federal agents, their annoyance instantly transformed into utter confusion. Brianna lowered her designer sunglasses from the top of her head to her eyes, as if trying to get a better look at the uninvited guests interrupting her massive payday. Kendrick, however, did not look confused at all. The absolute second his dark eyes locked onto the glowing yellow FBI letters printed on the back of the lead agent's windbreaker, the smug and arrogant smile completely vanished from his face. The healthy brown color of his skin rapidly drained away, leaving him looking like a pale and terrified ghost. He recognized exactly who these people were, and he knew exactly why they were standing inside this boardroom. Kendrick immediately jumped up from his expensive leather chair so fast that the heavy piece of furniture violently tipped backward and crashed loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He frantically reached his shaking right hand into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his encrypted smartphone. His thumbs began moving across the glowing glass screen at lightning speed, desperately trying to access his digital settings to wipe the device clean of all his fraudulent banking applications and offshore routing numbers. He was entirely panicked, like a trapped animal, realizing the cage door had just snapped shut. "Drop the device right now!" the lead FBI agent barked in a voice so loud and authoritative it made my mother physically jump in her seat. Kendrick completely ignored the direct federal command and kept frantically swiping at his screen with shaking fingers. He was breathing heavily, and sweat was visibly beading on his forehead, ruining his perfectly manicured appearance. Before he could even execute the factory reset command, a massive federal agent stepped quickly around the marble table and aggressively grabbed Kendrick's wrist. The agent twisted Kendrick's arm firmly behind his back, forcing a loud gasp of pain from his lungs. The smartphone clattered onto the black marble table right next to the empty leather chair. The female SEC investigator calmly picked up the phone, placed it inside a static-proof evidence bag, and sealed it tightly shut. That device is now official property of the United States federal government, the female investigator stated in a cold and unwavering tone. Brianna suddenly let out a piercing shriek of pure outrage. She leaped up from her chair and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at the massive agent holding her husband's arm. "Get your hands off my husband right now, you psychotic thugs!" she screamed at the absolute top of her lungs. "Do you have any idea who we are? My husband is a highly successful real estate developer, and we are right in the middle of a private family business meeting. I am calling our lawyer, Mr. Sterling, right now, and he is going to sue every single one of you for harassment and physical assault." The lead FBI agent slowly pulled a folded piece of paper from his inside jacket pocket and placed it firmly on the table. "You can certainly try to call Mr. Sterling, Mom," the agent said without a single ounce of emotion in his voice. "But you will have to leave a voicemail. We raided his downtown law office exactly 30 minutes ago, and he is currently sitting in the back of a federal transport van in handcuffs. My father." Pastor Thomas finally found his voice. He stood up slowly, placing both of his trembling hands on the marble table to steady his shaking legs. He looked back and forth between the federal agents and me, with sheer panic swirling in his eyes. "Zoe, what in the name of God is the meaning of all this violence?" he demanded, with his authoritative preaching voice completely failing him. "Why are federal agents assaulting your brother-in-law in your corporate office?" I remained completely seated in my leather executive chair. I steepled my fingers together, resting them on the edge of the table, and looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. "This is not a corporate business negotiation anymore, Dad," I explained in a perfectly calm and measured voice that cut completely through the chaotic noise of the room. "This is the very end of Kendrick's massive criminal empire. You see, the FBI and the SEC have been quietly building a massive federal fraud case against your golden son-in-law for the last 8 straight months." My mother gasped loudly and clutched her expensive pearl necklace with both hands. "Fraud," she whispered in total disbelief. "That is absolutely impossible. Kendrick is building a commercial real estate fund. He is a blessing to our church community." "Kendrick is running a massive Ponzi scheme," I corrected her sharply, refusing to let her live in her delusional fantasy world for 1 second longer. "He never bought a single commercial property in his entire life. He has been systematically stealing the retirement savings of your elderly congregation members for 3 years. He used their hard-earned money to buy Brianna's designer clothes, her luxury cars, and her lavish vacations. But the money finally ran out, and the SEC scheduled a massive financial audit of his fake company for next week. He was totally cornered." I stood up and slowly walked around the marble table, stopping right in front of my sister, who was now trembling uncontrollably. "He did not need $5 million to save a lucrative real estate deal, Brianna," I told her while looking her up and down with absolute disgust. "He desperately needed $5 million in liquid cash to secretly replace the stolen church funds before the federal auditors arrived and threw him in prison. He thought he could just easily bully his wealthy sister-in-law into bailing him out of his federal crimes." My father shook his head rapidly in desperate denial. "No," he argued weakly. "That cannot be true. You are just trying to get out of paying the settlement money we agreed upon. Mr. Sterling filed a legitimate civil lawsuit against your company regarding my original partnership rights." "That is where you are entirely wrong, Dad," I said while turning to face him completely. "When Mr. Sterling sent me that vicious email threatening to destroy my tech company with a fabricated press release unless I handed over $5 million across state banking lines, he officially crossed the line from a civil dispute into a severe federal crime. Extortion and wire fraud are serious federal offenses, and because Kendrick aggressively demanded the ransom money in writing to explicitly cover up an ongoing Ponzi scheme, he completely handed the FBI the final nail in his own coffin. By forcing me to agree to this meeting today, he provided the federal government with undeniable proof of premeditated extortion." The corporate venture capital attorney Richard stepped forward and adjusted his tie. He looked at my parents with the cold calculation of a man who destroys hostile takeovers for a living. And as the legal representative of the acquiring firm, I can officially confirm that we fully cooperated with the federal authorities to monitor every single communication your son-in-law sent to my client. You attempted to extort a corporate entity currently valued in the tens of millions of dollars. You played a very stupid game with very serious people. The reality of the devastating situation finally crashed down on my family like a collapsing brick wall. The arrogant illusion of their wealth and their untouchable social status was completely shattered into a million tiny pieces on the floor of my boardroom. Kendrick was no longer fighting against the massive agent holding his arm. He simply stood there with his head hanging down in total defeat, entirely broken and completely exposed as the pathetic thief he truly was. My mother Brenda collapsed back into her chair, sobbing heavily into her hands, as the absolute destruction of her flawless public reputation became a terrifying reality. But Brianna completely refused to accept her sudden, devastating downfall. Her face turned a bright and furious shade of red. She lunged forward across the marble table, completely blinded by her own rage and her sickening sense of entitlement. She pointed her shaking finger inches from my face. "You set my husband up, you evil witch!" Brianna screamed at me while tears of pure fury streamed down her ruined makeup. "You orchestrated this entire thing just to ruin my beautiful life because you are jealous of me. You are a disgusting liar and a traitor to your own family." She violently turned her head toward our father, who was still standing completely frozen in shock. "Dad, do not just stand there and let her do this to us. Use your legal leverage right now. Use your 40% claim on her entire company to hire the best defense lawyers in the country and bail Kendrick out of this mess." I looked at my screaming sister, and then I looked at my father. I felt a slow and chilling, predatory smile spread completely across my face. I reached over to my black briefcase and gently tapped the thick leather exterior. "About that 40% claim," I said softly, letting the dangerous words hang heavily in the silent room. "About that 40% claim," I said softly, letting the dangerous words hang heavily in the silent room. I kept my hand resting firmly on the top of my leather briefcase. "You all came into this boardroom today fully believing you were incredibly smart. You thought you could use a decade-old signature on a tiny office lease to completely hijack my entire life. You sued me for a massive cut of an $8 million sale. But there is a very funny thing about corporate acquisitions that you clearly did not bother to research before you decided to launch your greedy little extortion campaign. $8 million was just my liquid cash payout. It was the upfront signing bonus for handing over the foundational intellectual property of my logistics software. The total acquisition of my company, including the restricted stock options, the physical assets, and the subsidiary holdings, was actually valued at exactly $18 million. The sheer magnitude of that massive number instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the glass boardroom. $18 million. Brianna actually stopped her hysterical crying for a brief second and stared at me with her mouth hanging completely open. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble violently as the reality of her own stupidity finally washed over her. She had actively helped her criminal husband orchestrate an illegal extortion plot to steal a tiny fraction of my actual wealth. If she had just treated me like a real human being, she might have actually benefited from my massive corporate success legitimately. The staggering amount of money was far beyond anything she or Kendrick had ever dreamed of stealing. My father took a highly unsteady step backward until the back of his knees hit his leather chair. He collapsed downward into the seat, staring at me as if I were a complete stranger. $18 million, he repeated in a quiet and highly breathless whisper. His mind was rapidly calculating exactly how much a 40% share of that massive fortune would have been. He was clearly imagining a payout of over $7 million. He looked down at the black marble table, and then his eyes darted directly toward my closed black briefcase. I saw the exact moment the greedy realization hit his brain. He thought he still had a valid legal claim to a massive portion of my newly revealed wealth, but I was not going to let him hold on to that false hope for a single second longer. I smoothly flipped the metal latches of my briefcase open and reached inside the dark compartment. I pulled out the crisp white pages of the global release of claims that they had all eagerly signed just 10 minutes ago. I held the legally binding document up high so the bright overhead lights illuminated their dark signatures at the bottom of the page. I want you to look very closely at this contract, Dad, I instructed him in a cold and merciless tone. You were in such a massive rush to get your hands on my money that you did not even bother to read the specific liability clauses you were signing. You just blindly signed your name because Kendrick told you it was a guaranteed payday. But because you eagerly signed this binding legal document, you officially agreed to sever all ties and future financial claims to my estate. You legally waived your fraudulent 40% partnership claim in direct exchange for a $5 million settlement payout. My father swallowed hard and attempted to regain some of his lost authority. Yes, he stammered weakly. We signed it for the $5 million. So hand over the check right now and we will leave. I slowly shook my head and offered him a look of pure, unadulterated pity. You really do not understand how federal law works, do you? I asked him flatly. This specific contract was drafted entirely contingent upon a financial payout. But because that payout was aggressively demanded as part of an illegal extortion attempt, orchestrated by your son-in-law, the financial obligation of this contract is now completely voided by federal extortion laws. You cannot legally enforce a financial payout that was demanded under the direct threat of a fabricated media smear campaign and wire fraud. The federal agents standing right behind you already have the documented proof of the criminal extortion attempt. The $5 million settlement is legally null and void. I paused for a brief moment to let the devastating legal reality sink deeply into their greedy minds. But the severance of your familial rights and the legal forfeiture of your partnership claims are still entirely binding, I continued mercilessly. You sign those specific rights away the absolute second you put your pen to this paper. So, Dad, because you chose to blindly follow a criminal instead of trusting your own daughter, you now own absolutely 0% of my $18 million company. You get absolutely nothing. The crushing weight of my words slammed into my father like a speeding freight train. The righteous and arrogant Pastor Thomas was completely destroyed right in front of my eyes. He realized in that exact agonizing moment that his own blind greed had completely ruined him. He had willingly traded a legitimate and deeply loving daughter for a pathetic criminal son-in-law. He had actively participated in a cruel plot to destroy my business just to save a man who was simultaneously stealing from his own church congregation. And in his desperate rush to secure his unearned millions, he had literally signed away his only piece of fabricated legal leverage. He had absolutely nothing left to use against me. My mother Brenda began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved up and down in rapid and highly erratic motions as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. She looked at Kendrick, who was still standing with his head bowed down in complete shame, while the federal agent maintained a firm grip on his arm. She realized that everything they had built their entire social identity upon was a massive lie. The expensive tailored suits, the leased luxury vehicles, the grand promises of generational wealth were all built on the stolen life savings of their trusting church members. And she had actively chosen to protect that disgusting lie instead of protecting her own flesh and blood. Brenda suddenly stood up and slammed both of her hands flat onto the black marble table. She glared at me with a look of pure maternal hatred. She could not accept the fact that she was entirely responsible for her own massive downfall. She desperately needed to make me the villain in her twisted narrative. "Fine," she screamed at me while spit flew from her trembling lips. "Keep your filthy money, Zoe. We do not need a single dime of your corporate fortune. We do not want anything to do with you ever again. We still have our beautiful church. We still have our massive house. We have an entire community of loving people who will support us through this terrible misunderstanding. We do not need you." I slowly placed the signed global release of claims back inside my secure briefcase and snapped the locks shut. I looked at my mother with a completely blank expression. She was still clinging desperately to the false illusion of her comfortable life. She thought she could just walk out of my boardroom, go back to her sprawling colonial home, and pretend none of this ever happened. She thought she could simply sweep Kendrick's massive federal crimes under the rug and continue hosting elegant Sunday dinners in her perfect, pristine kitchen. I took a slow, deep breath and prepared to deliver the absolute final blow to her shattered reality. I was going to systematically strip away every single layer of security she thought she still possessed. She had chosen to declare war on my life, and I was going to finish it with absolute corporate precision. "No, Mom," I said in a very soft and incredibly chilling voice. I slowly shook my head back and forth while looking directly into her panicked eyes. "You do not have the house either." The silence that followed my statement was absolute and entirely suffocating. The federal agent standing near the doorway remained completely still while watching the dramatic family collapse unfold before them. Richard, the corporate venture capital attorney, adjusted his tie and watched my mother with a cold, clinical fascination. My father slowly raised his head and stared at me in total disbelief. "What did you just say?" he whispered hoarsely. "What do you mean we do not have our house?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished black marble table. "Did you really think I would uncover Kendrick's massive Ponzi scheme and not investigate the shadow lending firm he used to trick you into mortgaging your home?" I asked them. "That fraudulent equity loan you signed last Friday was the final piece of the puzzle. I instructed my corporate buyers to execute a secondary buyout of that specific high-risk loan portfolio yesterday afternoon. My holding company now holds the legal deed to your house. Checkmate. I am your new landlord." The absolute silence in the glass boardroom was deafening. My father, Pastor Thomas, stared at me with his mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the magnitude of the corporate maneuver I had just executed. His mind was desperately trying to find a logical loophole, a way out of the terrifying reality I had just presented to him. My mother, Brenda, slowly sank back into her leather chair, her perfectly styled hair suddenly looking completely disheveled as the blood drained entirely from her face. She looked at me, and then she looked at Kendrick, who was still standing silently in the iron grip of the federal agent. "Let me explain exactly how a house of cards collapses, Dad," I said while maintaining my steady and icy gaze. "When I hired my forensic accountant to look into Kendrick's highly suspicious real estate fund, I did not just look at his personal bank accounts. I demanded a comprehensive audit of every single corporate entity attached to his name. That massive printed dossier I slammed onto your kitchen island on Sunday contained all the answers. It detailed the exact financial structure of the sketchy private lending firm Kendrick used to magically fast-track your $1 million equity loan. The firm was not a legitimate financial institution. It was a poorly disguised shadow lender operating completely off the books. And that firm was severely overleveraged and actively failing because it was entirely propped up by Kendrick's own massive bad debts. I slowly walked the length of the black marble table, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. Kendrick was running a classic Ponzi scheme. He used new money to pay off old investors to keep the illusion of his wealth alive. But when the new money finally stopped coming in, his shadow lending firm began bleeding cash at an uncontrollable rate. He needed a massive injection of capital to keep his criminal enterprise afloat, and that is exactly where you and Mom came into the picture. He saw your completely paid-off family home as a massive untapped piggy bank. He manipulated your immense pride and your blind trust to convince you to mortgage the property. He told you the money was for the church expansion project. But in reality, he took that $1 million of your equity to pay off his most aggressive creditors and to fund Brianna's lavish lifestyle. My father gripped this edge of the table so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. "He did not invest it in the church?" he asked in a hollow and broken voice. I let out a sharp and humorless laugh. "He never intended to give a single dime of that money to your church," I replied coldly. "He stole your equity to buy those tailored suits and that leased sports car sitting in the parking garage right now." But because his shadow lending firm was actively collapsing under the massive weight of federal scrutiny, it became a highly distressed financial asset. And in the corporate world, distressed assets can be purchased for absolute pennies on the dollar if you have the right amount of liquid capital and a ruthless legal team ready to strike. I reached back into my black leather briefcase and pulled out a fresh manila folder. I opened it and extracted a heavy legal document adorned with official county stamps and notary seals. I tossed it effortlessly across the polished marble surface. The thick paper slid smoothly and stopped right over the global release of claims they had just signed. "That is the official deed of trust for your home," I announced proudly. "Yesterday afternoon, I instructed my venture capital partners to aggressively buy out that specific high-risk loan portfolio through a subsidiary shell company. It was an incredibly simple corporate acquisition. They were desperate for cash, and we had plenty of it to spare. As of this morning, my holding company is the majority debt holder of your residential mortgage. I technically own the roof over your heads and the very ground your house is built upon." My mother let out a small, terrified whimper. "But we just signed the paperwork last week," she cried out desperately. "The first loan payment is not even due until the end of the month. We have plenty of time to figure this out and find the money to pay you back." I leaned forward and placed both of my hands flat on the table, looking directly into my mother's panicked eyes. "That is the truly beautiful irony of this entire situation, Mom," I explained with a chilling smile. "When Kendrick set up your fraudulent mortgage, he tied the automatic monthly payments directly to his own corporate investment accounts to make it look like he was generously covering the debt for you. But as the female investigator from the Securities and Exchange Commission just told you, every single one of Kendrick's bank accounts and financial assets was officially frozen by the federal government at exactly 8 o'clock this morning." I pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at the glowing digital clock on the boardroom wall. "Because those accounts are completely frozen, the initial balloon payment attached to your mortgage bounced exactly 4 hours ago. Under the strict default clauses hidden deep in the paperwork, Kendrick forced you to sign your mortgage officially went into severe financial default today. The grace period is entirely non-existent. The foreclosure process can legally begin whenever I decide to file the paperwork." The devastating realization finally sank deep into my parents' minds. The heavy fog of their willful ignorance was violently ripped away, exposing the ugly and terrifying truth of their situation. They had blindly trusted a charismatic con artist simply because he wore expensive clothes and told them exactly what they wanted to hear. They had eagerly handed over the deed to the home they had lived in for over 30 years. And in return, Kendrick had completely scammed them, stripping away their lifelong equity just to buy designer handbags and luxury vacations for their spoiled golden child. My father slowly turned his head to look at Kendrick. The look in Pastor Thomas' eyes was no longer filled with righteous indignation or pastoral pride. It was filled with pure, unadulterated hatred and a profound sense of absolute betrayal. "You stole from us," my father whispered, his voice shaking with intense rage. "You came into my home, you ate at my dinner table, and you looked me dead in the eye while you robbed my family blind. You took the house I worked my entire life to pay off." Kendrick could not even look at my father. He kept his eyes glued firmly to the floor, a pathetic coward who had finally run out of lies to tell. The massive federal agent holding his arm tightened his grip, causing Kendrick to wince in physical pain. The corporate venture capital attorney Richard watched the entire exchange with a look of absolute professional satisfaction. He had seen countless hostile takeovers in his lengthy career, but he clearly recognized the flawless execution of the trap I had just sprung on my toxic family. My mother, Brenda, turned her furious gaze toward her favorite daughter. Brianna had been sitting completely frozen in her chair, her face entirely devoid of color. "Brianna, did you know about this?" Brenda demanded loudly. "Did you know your husband was stealing our home to pay for your ridiculous shopping sprees and your country club memberships?" "I did not know," Brianna cried out defensively, tears streaming rapidly down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "I swear to God, Mom, I had absolutely no idea where the money was coming from. Kendrick told me his real estate deals were incredibly successful. He told me we were incredibly rich." "You are not rich, Brianna," I interrupted her, harshly refusing to let her play the innocent victim in this room. "You are completely broke. In fact, you are far worse than broke, because the federal government is going to seize every single asset purchased with stolen funds. Your cars, your jewelry, your designer clothes. They are all going to be auctioned off to pay restitution to the elderly church members your husband viciously scammed. You have absolutely nothing left. Your entire life is a massive lie built on stolen money." The heavy glass doors of the boardroom suddenly felt like the walls of an inescapable prison cell for my family. The sheer magnitude of their complete and total destruction was suffocating. They had walked into my corporate office fully expecting to walk out $5 million richer, having successfully bullied me into submission. Instead, they had unknowingly signed away their only legal leverage, discovered their golden son-in-law was a federal criminal, and realized they had lost their family home to the daughter they had spent 30 years actively discarding. My mother Brenda was now sobbing uncontrollably in her chair, covering her face with her hands, unable to witness the total degradation of her favorite child. The pristine image of the perfect pastor's wife was entirely shattered, leaving behind a broken woman who had willingly sacrificed her own security for the sake of social appearances. She had proudly flaunted Kendrick to the entire church congregation, portraying him as a financial genius blessed by God. Now the entire community would quickly discover that their beloved pastor and his wife had actively enabled a predator to steal their hard-earned retirement savings. The impending public scandal would undoubtedly force Pastor Thomas to step down from the pulpit in complete and utter disgrace. They would lose their income, their social standing, and their home all in one single devastating day. Brianna looked at the federal agents who were now preparing to physically remove Kendrick from the boardroom. The reality of her impending future slammed into her with brutal force. Her husband was going to federal prison. Her fake luxury lifestyle was entirely over. She had no money, no home, and her parents were completely bankrupt. In a sudden and highly desperate move, Brianna threw herself out of her expensive leather chair. She stumbled forward across the hardwood floor and completely abandoned every single ounce of her deeply ingrained pride. She dropped heavily to her knees right in front of where I was standing. She reached out with her shaking hands and grabbed the edge of my tailored suit jacket, clutching the dark fabric with desperate strength. "Zoe, please," she wailed hysterically, her voice cracking with sheer terror and absolute desperation. "Please do not do this to us. You cannot let them take Kendrick away to prison. He is the father of my child. Please, you have all the money and all the power now. You can fix this. You can pay off the federal investigators and stop the foreclosure. We are your family, Zoe. We are blood." I kept my posture perfectly rigid and refused to step away from Brianna's desperate grasp. I wanted her to feel the cold, hard reality of her situation. I wanted her to fully understand that the safety net she had always relied upon was completely gone. The money she had eagerly anticipated, the $5 million she had bragged about on the internet, was never going to materialize. The extravagant weekend she had planned, the luxury cars she intended to buy, were nothing more than a foolish fantasy. She was kneeling before the sister she had mocked and ridiculed, forced to beg for a salvation that was entirely out of her reach. The federal agents shifted their weight, clearly ready to conclude the arrest and transport the prisoner to the holding facility. Kendrick remained completely silent, offering absolutely no words of comfort or defense to his hysterical wife. He knew the evidence against him was insurmountable. The encrypted phone, the forensic accounting, the wire fraud demands. It was an airtight federal case. Brianna looked up at me with mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. "Please, Zoe," she begged again, her voice reduced to a pathetic whimper. "I will do whatever you want. I will apologize for everything. Just please remember that we are blood." I stared down at my younger sister kneeling on the cold hardwood floor of my corporate boardroom. The sight of her ruined designer clothes and her tear-stained face brought absolutely no joy to my heart, but it also brought no sympathy. I looked at the woman who had made it her lifelong mission to ensure I felt small and insignificant in our family. "Blood," I repeated softly, letting the word hang in the chilled air of the room. "You dare to bring up our blood right now, Brianna. You did not care about my blood when you maliciously convinced Mom and Dad to drain my college fund just so you could have a lavish graduation party. You did not care about my blood when you stood in front of our entire church congregation and loudly proclaimed that my software company was just a pathetic little hobby for a lonely woman. You did not care about my blood when you actively helped your criminal husband draft a fake press release designed to completely destroy my entire professional reputation." I took a slow step backward, physically distancing myself from her desperate grasp. She reached out again, but I simply pulled my tailored suit jacket away from her trembling hands. You spent 3 decades actively destroying every single opportunity I had just to elevate yourself. You constantly belittled my clothes, my friends, my education, and my ambitions. You told everyone who would listen that I was a massive failure, who would never amount to anything in this world. You didn't care about my blood when you told everyone I was a failure. You only care about my blood now because it's the only thing that can fund your delusions. You do not love me, Brianna. You never have. You just love the money you thought you could steal from me. And now that the stolen money is officially gone, you are finally realizing that you are nothing without it. You are just a hollow shell of a person who built an entire identity on the suffering and financial exploitation of other people. Brianna let out a loud and guttural sob, collapsing entirely onto the floor. She buried her face in her hands, completely unable to look at me anymore. Her massive diamond wedding ring flashed under the bright boardroom lights, serving as a sickening reminder of the elderly church members whose retirement accounts had paid for it. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, breaking the tense silence in the room. Kendrick Washington, the agent said in a loud and completely authoritative voice. You are officially under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate extortion, and multiple violations of the Securities Exchange Act. The massive agent standing behind Kendrick firmly pushed the disgraced real estate investor against the thick glass wall of the boardroom. The sharp metallic clicking sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Kendrick's wrists echoed loudly through the room. It was the undeniable sound of absolute finality. The agent began reciting Kendrick's Miranda rights in a rapid and practiced tone, ensuring every single legal protocol was followed perfectly. You have the right to remain silent, the agent chanted, as he forcefully spun Kendrick around to face the door. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. Kendrick offered absolutely no physical resistance. His shoulders slumped forward in total defeat. He looked like a deflated balloon, completely stripped of all the fake swagger and arrogant confidence he had paraded into my office with just an hour earlier. The expensive tailored suit he wore suddenly looked like a ridiculous costume on a very small and frightened man. The federal agents firmly grabbed him by both arms and began marching him toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. I watched through the transparent walls as my entire corporate staff gathered quietly in the outer hallways. My employees, my financial analysts, my software developers, and my vice presidents stood silently watching the highly dramatic scene unfold. They watched the arrogant man, who had tried to extort their CEO, being paraded out in federal handcuffs. As the agents pushed Kendrick through the main doors, Brianna suddenly scrambled up from the floor. She slipped wildly on her expensive high heels, completely forgetting her fabricated socialite dignity. Kendrick, she wailed hysterically, her voice cracking with pure terror. Kendrick, do not leave me here. What am I supposed to do? She chased after him into the crowded hallway, screaming his name and sobbing violently in front of dozens of my silent employees. She grabbed at the sleeves of the federal agents, desperately trying to pull them away from her husband. The agents professionally but firmly pushed her away, forming a physical barrier around their federal prisoner. The elevator doors slid open with a cheerful chime, and the agents shoved her husband inside, entirely ignoring her frantic pleading. The silver doors slid shut, cutting off her screams and leaving her completely alone in the corporate hallway to face the judgmental stares of my entire staff. I turned my attention back to the massive black marble table. My mother Brenda and my father Pastor Thomas were still sitting in their expensive leather chairs, completely broken and entirely motionless. The grand illusion of their perfect family was now officially a smoking crater. Pastor Thomas slowly wiped a single heavy bead of sweat from his forehead. He looked at me and attempted to straighten his posture desperately, trying to summon the commanding presence he used to control his massive church congregation every single Sunday morning. He cleared his throat loudly, attempting to project authority into a room where he had absolutely none left. Now, Zoe, my father began using his deepest and most resonant pastoral voice. This entire situation has clearly gotten completely out of hand. You have made your point very effectively today. You have successfully proven that you are a powerful corporate executive and a brilliant businesswoman. But we are still your parents. I demand that you call off this ridiculous foreclosure immediately. You need to use your immense wealth to hire a massive legal defense team to fix this ungodly disaster. We urgently need to protect the pristine reputation of the church before the local news media gets a hold of this story. I cut him off immediately before he could utter another single word of his ridiculous demands. My voice was sharp and cut through the room like a freshly sharpened blade. Do not you ever try to use that demanding tone with me again, Dad. I snapped loudly, stepping right up to the edge of the marble table. Your authority in my life completely died the exact moment you sat at that steakhouse table and allowed a criminal to extort your own daughter. You sat there and proudly co-signed my absolute destruction just so you could line your own greedy pockets. You actively chose to protect a massive financial predator instead of protecting your own flesh and blood. You lost the right to demand absolutely anything from me when you eagerly signed that global release of claims and willingly disowned me for a $5 million payout that you are never going to see. I pointed my finger directly at his chest. You are not my pastor. You are certainly not my father anymore. You are just a highly desperate man who foolishly gambled his entire life savings on a massive lie and lost absolutely everything. You built your entire legacy on vanity and pride, and now you get to watch it all burn to the ground. I watched my father's jaw clench so tightly I thought his teeth might actually shatter. The undeniable truth of my words hit him with a physical force. For his entire adult life, he had preached about the heavy consequences of sin and the ultimate price of greed to thousands of devoted listeners. He had stood on a highly elevated stage and judged the morality of everyone around him. Yet when the true test of his own character arrived, he had failed spectacularly. He had traded his moral compass for a shiny gold watch and a fraudulent equity loan. He had sold his soul to a con artist, and the final bill had just come completely due. My mother, Brenda, let out a soft and pathetic whimper. She looked around the pristine glass boardroom as if she were desperately searching for a hidden escape route from this waking nightmare. Her hands were shaking so violently that her expensive diamond bracelets rattled loudly against the heavy marble table. She looked at the empty leather chair where her golden son-in-law had been sitting just moments before, and the brutal reality of her absolute bankruptcy finally settled deep into her bones. All those years she had spent carefully cultivating her flawless image among the wealthy church aunties were entirely wasted. She would no longer be the highly respected matriarch hosting elegant garden parties. She would be known as the foolish woman who handed her family home to a federal criminal. The overwhelming shame of her impending social exile was clearly suffocating her. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to offer a desperate apology, as if she wanted to suddenly pretend she had loved me all along. But the absolute coldness in my eyes stopped the pathetic lie before it could even leave her throat. I walked back over to my leather executive chair and casually picked up the heavy deed of trust to their massive colonial home. I tapped the thick legal document against the black marble table, staring completely through the two people who had brought me into this world. I felt absolutely no guilt and no remorse for what I was about to do. They had forged this weapon, and I was simply delivering the final blow. The strict terms of your defaulted mortgage are incredibly clear, I told them in a cold and unwavering tone. The standard grace period does not exist because the original loan was structured as a high-risk predatory asset by your own son-in-law. However, because I am a highly reasonable corporate entity, and because I prefer to do things completely by the book, I will graciously give you a minor extension. I tossed the deed of trust back into my briefcase and snapped the metal locks completely shut for the final time. You have exactly 30 days to figure out how to pay the massive balloon payment on this mortgage entirely on your own, I announced with absolute finality. I strongly suggest you start packing your expensive furniture and liquidating your assets immediately. Because if you cannot produce the required funds by the very end of the month, I will legally foreclose on the property without a single moment of hesitation. I will have the county sheriff evict you from the premises, and I will sell the land directly to a commercial real estate developer. The choice is entirely yours. The choice is entirely yours, I told them before turning my back on the people who used to be my parents. I walked out of the glass boardroom without waiting for their response. I left them sitting in the suffocating silence of their own making, surrounded by the shattered pieces of their fake empire. News of a federal raid travels incredibly fast, especially when it involves a prominent religious figure in a tight-knit community. By Sunday morning, the massive scandal had completely detonated across the city of Atlanta. The dramatic fallout was swifter and far more destructive than I had ever anticipated. The very same church aunties who had aggressively cornered me in the fellowship hall just 1 week ago were now experiencing a terrifying reality check. The federal investigators did not waste any time. The Securities and Exchange Commission immediately froze the assets of every shell company tied to Kendrick's name and began sending official legal notices to the defrauded investors. Auntie Shirley, the woman who had loudly condemned my lack of Christian charity, received a certified letter stating that her entire life savings was completely gone. She had bragged about her exclusive investment to everyone at the church choir practice, and now she was entirely bankrupt. The $50,000 she had eagerly handed to Kendrick expecting a massive return was completely vaporized in his Ponzi scheme. The panic spread through the congregation like a raging wildfire. The whispers of judgment that were once directed at my single status and my corporate career were rapidly replaced by screams of pure outrage directed entirely at my family. The church community realized they had been completely played. They had been manipulated by the very people they trusted to lead their spiritual lives. The women who had actively praised Brianna's luxury lifestyle suddenly realized that they were the ones unknowingly paying for her designer handbags and her expensive vacations. My father, Pastor Thomas, arrogantly attempted to salvage his ruined reputation by holding a special emergency service that Sunday. He planned to stand behind his expensive acrylic podium and cast himself as just another innocent victim of Kendrick's deep deception. He wanted to use his deep, charismatic voice to soothe the angry crowd and maintain his powerful position. He tried to quote scriptures about forgiveness and unexpected trials, but his words fell on completely deaf ears. The people he had sworn to shepherd had been led directly to the financial slaughter. The congregation was absolutely not having it. Before he could even open his leather-bound Bible, a massive group of angry deacons and defrauded elders marched directly up to the altar. They did not want to hear his practiced prayers or his fake apologies. They wanted their hard-earned retirement money back. They loudly demanded to know why their trusted pastor had actively encouraged them to invest in a criminal enterprise while simultaneously using the church's influence to secure a fraudulent mortgage on his own home. The confrontation was brutally public and completely humiliating. My father was loudly booed off his own stage by the very people who used to hang on his every word. The shouting echoed off the stained glass windows, shattering the illusion of his holy authority. By Monday afternoon, the regional church board had officially forced Pastor Thomas to step down from the pulpit in complete and utter disgrace. He was permanently stripped of his pastoral credentials and completely banished from the religious community he had ruled with an iron fist for over 2 decades. The righteous king was finally dethroned, and the congregation turned all their blazing anger onto Thomas and Brenda for vouching for a criminal. While my parents were facing the intense wrath of the church congregation, Brianna was experiencing a rapid and brutal descent into absolute poverty. With Kendrick's bank accounts completely frozen and his assets officially seized by the federal government, her lavish lifestyle evaporated overnight. The reality check did not come with a polite warning. It came in the middle of the night with the loud grinding gears of heavy tow trucks and the flashing amber lights of repossession agents. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Brianna woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of diesel engines idling outside her leased luxury home. She ran out into the driveway, wearing her designer silk pajamas, just in time to watch the repo men drag her shiny Mercedes-Benz and Kendrick's imported sports car onto the back of their flatbed trucks. She screamed and cried and threatened to call the police, but the repo men simply handed her the federal seizure documents and drove away into the dark night. Her expensive diamond wedding ring, the one she loved flashing in my face, was also confiscated as criminal evidence. The neighbors she had always acted superior to stood on their porches and watched her humiliating breakdown. Within 48 hours, Brianna was officially evicted from her luxury rental property because the massive lease was entirely funded by Kendrick's criminal shell companies. She had absolutely nowhere else to go. The golden child who had spent her entire life looking down on everyone around her was forcefully humbled. She had to pack whatever clothes she could fit into cheap cardboard boxes and move back into my parents' heavily mortgaged colonial house. She returned to her childhood bedroom entirely broke, deeply disgraced, and completely shunned by the wealthy socialite circles she used to rule. Her fake friends, the women who used to drink champagne with her on Instagram Live, immediately blocked her phone number the absolute second they saw Kendrick's mugshot broadcast on the evening news. She was entirely alone, trapped in a failing house with two disgraced parents facing a mountain of debt they could never repay. The kingdom of lies they had built together was fully collapsing on top of them. The crushing weight of their new reality finally pushed my mother to the absolute edge of desperation. Exactly 2 weeks after the dramatic boardroom confrontation, I was sitting in the quiet luxury of my secure downtown condo, reviewing the final acquisition paperwork for my tech company. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from the front desk of my luxury building. I answered the call and the head concierge spoke in a highly apologetic tone. He informed me that a frantic older woman was currently standing in the main lobby, causing a massive scene and demanding to be led upstairs. I immediately pulled up the live security camera feed on my tablet screen. There she was. My mother, Brenda, was standing near the polished marble reception desk, looking completely unrecognizable. The beautiful lobby of my building, with its soft ambient lighting and modern art, provided a stark contrast to the absolute chaos she brought with her. The woman who had always prioritized her flawless outward appearance above her own daughter's well-being looked entirely unhinged. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes were wrinkled, and her face was puffy from days of endless crying. She was aggressively clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver in a stormy ocean. I watched the silent video feed as she dramatically pleaded with the stern security guard. I could easily read her lips as she begged the man to let her up to the penthouse to see her baby girl. She was putting on a pathetic performance of a heartbroken mother, desperately seeking comfort from her successful daughter. She cried and waved her hands around, hoping someone would take pity on her and grant her access to my secure sanctuary. But I knew the absolute truth. She did not want comfort. She wanted money. She wanted me to magically write a massive check to save their foreclosed house and rescue them from the severe consequences of their own toxic greed. She wanted me to save her from the social exile of the church and the financial ruin that Kendrick had unleashed upon them. She had spent my entire life choosing Brianna over me. She had actively helped a criminal try to steal my life's work. She had slapped me across the face when I tried to warn her, and she had willingly signed away her rights to me for a payout that never came. And now that her golden child was broke and her husband was disgraced, she suddenly remembered she had another daughter to exploit. I watched her cry fake tears on the high-definition screen, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold sense of total finality. The little girl inside me who used to beg for her mother's approval was completely gone. That desperate child had been replaced by a strong, successful woman who finally recognized her own undeniable worth. I picked up the phone to speak directly to the lobby desk. The concierge waited patiently for my instructions over the secure line. I stared at the glowing screen, watching the woman who gave birth to me completely unravel in the beautiful marble lobby. "I don't have a mother," I said in a perfectly calm and unwavering voice. "Please have security escort that woman off the premises." I hung up the phone and turned my attention back to the massive stack of acquisition contracts sitting on my desk. I did not watch the security feed to see my mother being physically removed from the polished marble lobby. I simply did not care anymore. But her desperate attempt to ambush me at my private residence proved that they still did not fully comprehend the absolute finality of the situation. They still believed they could manipulate their way out of the devastating consequences they had actively chosen. I was not going to leave any room for misinterpretation. I immediately picked up my phone and called my lead corporate attorney. I instructed her to enforce the global release of claims to the absolute letter of the law. By the following morning, every single member of my former family received a formal cease and desist order delivered directly to their heavily mortgaged colonial house by a private process server. The strict legal document barred them from ever contacting me, my corporate associates, my venture capital partners, or my private building security ever again. If they attempted to call, text, email, or physically approach me, they would be immediately arrested for criminal harassment and trespassing. The heavy legal wall was completely constructed, and the drawbridge was permanently pulled up. I changed my personal phone number and instructed my executive assistant to automatically filter any incoming emails containing their names directly into a digital trash bin. I was completely done playing their twisted games. The toxic umbilical cord was finally and legally severed. They were completely blocked from every single avenue of my life. The process server later provided a detailed report of the delivery. My father had answered the door in a stained undershirt, looking completely haggard. When he was handed the thick legal packet, his initial anger quickly dissolved into terrifying realization. The documents clearly outlined the immediate legal consequences of violating the restraining order, including severe financial penalties and guaranteed jail time. I made sure the legal language was utterly devoid of any familial warmth. It read like a corporate mandate issued against a hostile foreign entity. I even took the extra precaution of alerting my private security detail at both my office building and my residential tower, providing them with high-resolution photographs of Thomas, Brenda, and Brianna. They were officially placed on a permanent blacklist. If they even stepped foot on the pavement outside my properties, the local police would be dispatched in under 2 minutes. I went back to running my massive tech logistics company and left them to drown in the shallow pool they had dug for themselves. True to my word, I watched the calendar on my office wall slowly tick down the days. The 30-day grace period I had generously granted them was rapidly evaporating. I knew they were frantically scrambling to find a way to pay the massive balloon payment Kendrick had secretly structured into their fraudulent equity loan. But without their disgraced church congregation to exploit, and without Kendrick's illegal Ponzi scheme pumping stolen money into their bank accounts, they had absolutely zero financial resources. Traditional banks completely refused to speak with a disgraced pastor, whose son-in-law was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, awaiting trial for wire fraud. They were entirely blacklisted from the local financial community. When the 30th day finally arrived and the deadline officially passed without a single cent being deposited into my holding company accounts, I did not feel a sudden rush of malicious joy. I did not gloat or celebrate their total financial ruin. I simply felt a cold and calculating sense of corporate efficiency. I authorized my financial management team to initiate the formal foreclosure process. It was handled exactly like any other defaulted commercial asset in our massive portfolio. The legal paperwork was filed with the county clerk. The eviction notices were officially posted on their heavy mahogany front door, and the massive property was immediately listed on the commercial real estate market. The beautiful brick colonial house that had served as the ultimate symbol of their arrogant superiority was nothing more than a simple line item on a corporate spreadsheet. I did not do it out of revenge. I did it because that is exactly how the real world operates when you eagerly sign contracts with financial predators. I received a brief automated email from the county sheriff's department confirming that the official eviction notice had been successfully served and posted. The bright yellow paper taped directly to their custom-painted front door was a glaring public advertisement of their complete and utter failure. The wealthy neighbors who used to attend their lavish holiday parties now drove slowly past the property, whispering and pointing at the undeniable proof of their financial collapse. There were no more extensions and absolutely no more negotiations. The corporate machine I had unleashed upon them was completely devoid of human emotion. It processed their massive debt with ruthless mechanical precision. I signed the authorization forms to auction the property without a single ounce of hesitation. The swift and brutal foreclosure completely shattered the last remaining pieces of their fake perfect illusion. Thomas, Brenda, and Brianna were officially forced to pack up their entire lives and vacate the sprawling property. Because they had absolutely no money and terrible credit, they could not secure a lease in any of the wealthy neighborhoods they used to dominate. They were violently thrust into a harsh reality they had spent their entire lives desperately avoiding. From what I heard through the local grapevine, they were forced to move into a cramped and highly outdated two-bedroom apartment in a far less desirable part of Atlanta. The massive transition was a total nightmare for them. Brianna, the former golden child who used to spend her weekends sipping expensive champagne at the country club, was now sleeping on a cheap fold-out couch in the tiny living room of a rented apartment. She had to take the public bus to the local grocery store because her luxury vehicles had been seized and sold at a federal auction to pay restitution to Kendrick's victims. My mother, Brenda, the woman who used to host lavish garden parties for the elite church aunties, was now forced to cook in a tiny galley kitchen with peeling linoleum floors. The expensive antique furniture she had prized for decades was completely gone sold to pawn shops and liquidators just to pay for their initial security deposit and basic moving expenses. And my father Thomas, the arrogant man who used to command the respect of thousands of devoted followers, was now a disgraced and unemployed old man sitting in a cramped apartment completely stripped of his precious authority. He spent his days staring blankly at the stained popcorn ceiling, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his public downfall. The sprawling brick colonial house they lost was quickly purchased by a commercial developer who immediately bulldozed the entire property to build a modern block of luxury townhouses. Every single physical trace of their false empire was completely erased from the affluent neighborhood they had prized above all else. They were left with absolutely nothing but the bitter consequences of their own toxic greed and the terrifying realization that they had completely destroyed their own lives. While my former family was busy adjusting to their new miserable reality, I was standing in the sleek glass boardroom of the venture capital firm, finalizing the absolute biggest deal of my entire professional career. I sat at the massive mahogany table surrounded by elite corporate lawyers and wealthy investors. The heavy stack of acquisition documents sat directly in front of me, waiting for my final approval. I picked up my expensive silver pen and smoothly signed my name on the very last page of the binding contract. The room erupted into polite applause and warm handshakes. The massive $18 million buyout was officially complete. The money was instantly transferred into my secure private trust accounts, ensuring my total financial independence for the rest of my natural life. I gathered my things and walked out of the towering glass skyscraper and onto the busy sunlit streets of downtown Atlanta. I took a deep breath of the warm city air and felt a profound physical shift happen deep inside my body. The chronic tension that had lived in my shoulders for 3 decades completely vanished. The heavy, suffocating weight of my toxic family was finally gone. I felt incredibly light. I felt lighter than I had ever felt in my entire 34 years of existence. I had successfully excised the toxic dead weight from my life with absolute surgical precision. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the unwanted daughter desperately seeking conditional love from people who were entirely incapable of giving it. I was a brilliant, wealthy, and completely independent woman. I was finally completely free. I won. Exactly 1 year has passed since that defining day in the glass boardroom when I severed the toxic ties that had bound me for over 3 decades. I am currently sitting on the expansive private balcony of my new multi-million-dollar penthouse apartment, high above the bustling streets of downtown Atlanta. The morning air is crisp and the rising sun is casting a beautiful golden glow across the towering glass skyscrapers that make up the beautiful city skyline. I take a slow sip of my hot black coffee and lean back into my comfortable lounge chair, taking a deep breath of fresh air. The utter silence in my home is not lonely. It is the most beautiful and expensive luxury I have ever purchased. There is no more yelling, there is no more gaslighting, there are no more manipulative phone calls demanding my hard-earned money to fund someone else's fake lifestyle. There is only the quiet and absolute peace of a life completely reclaimed and fiercely protected. A lot can change in the 365 days when the heavy curtain of lies is finally pulled back. The federal justice system moves notoriously slow, but Kendrick provided them with such an overwhelming amount of undeniable digital evidence that his trial was incredibly brief. He did not even have the chance to put on a charming tailored suit and try to smoothly talk his way out of his crimes in front of a jury. 2 months ago, he officially pleaded guilty to multiple counts of federal wire fraud extortion and operating an illegal Ponzi scheme. The federal judge was completely merciless during the sentencing hearing. Kendrick is currently serving a 10-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The smug arrogance he carried into my office has been permanently traded for a standard issue orange jumpsuit and a cold concrete cell. He will spend the next decade of his life completely stripped of the wealth and status he ruined so many innocent lives to acquire. My sister Brianna is living a completely different kind of prison sentence right here in the city. The federal government seized absolutely everything she owned down to her designer handbags, her expensive shoes, and her imported luxury vehicles. Without Kendrick's stolen money to float her lavish daily lifestyle, she was forcefully pushed out of her delusional fantasy world and made to actually enter the real world to get a job. I heard from a former mutual acquaintance that Brianna is currently working as a retail sales associate at the exact same high-end luxury mall she used to exclusively shop at. She spends her long 8-hour shifts folding clothes and fetching shoes for the wealthy women who used to be her country club friends. She spends her short lunch breaks hiding in the employee break room, frantically dodging aggressive phone calls from endless debt collectors. The golden child who genuinely believed she was destined for high society royalty is now forced to smile and ask customers if they need help finding their correct size. The absolute irony of her new reality is a harsh but highly necessary punishment for a lifetime of unearned entitlement and cruel behavior toward me. As for my parents, Thomas and Brenda, they have completely faded into absolute obscurity. After the massive public scandal forced my father out of the pulpit, they were entirely excommunicated from the religious community they had devoted their entire lives to controlling. The church congregation they betrayed completely turned their backs on them and refused to offer any financial charity. Without the massive church salary and the social influence they once wielded like a weapon, they are essentially ghosts in their own city. They are still living in that cramped 2-bedroom apartment in the less desirable part of town, struggling to pay their basic utility bills. Their once pristine public reputation is permanently ruined. They can no longer show their faces at local community events or high society dinners because everyone knows exactly what they did to their congregation and to their own daughter. They willingly mortgaged their morals and their family home for a criminal, and now they are paying the ultimate price in total isolation. They tried to reach out to me a few times through third-party mediators begging for financial forgiveness and a second chance, but my legal wall remained entirely impenetrable. The cease and desist order is completely permanent. Sitting here on my balcony looking out over the city I conquered, I find myself reflecting deeply on the concept of family, especially within the African American community. We are taught from a very young age that family is absolutely everything. We are aggressively conditioned to believe that blood loyalty is paramount, and that we must blindly support our relatives no matter how incredibly toxic or financially abusive they might be. It is a heavy generational curse that forces so many successful people to carry the dead weight of their manipulative relatives simply to avoid the painful stigma of being labeled a bad daughter or an ungrateful child. We are told to keep the peace and protect the family name, even when that family is actively destroying our mental health and aggressively draining our bank accounts. But I refuse to be a sacrificial lamb on the altar of their fake respectability. Breaking that generational curse was the hardest and most painful thing I have ever done, but it was also the most necessary step for my own survival. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that made you sick. You cannot build a legacy of genuine wealth and peace while remaining tethered to people who view your hard work as their personal lottery ticket. They thought my success was their bank account. But by trying to steal my worth, they handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to free myself. Sometimes the only way to win a rigged game is to let the cheaters play themselves. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and close the door on toxic family members? How did you protect your peace? Tell me your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of taking your power back.